The dirty secret about all of this really smart IT, software, infrastructure, intelligent digital city stuff that those of us who know it well can tell you after a drink, which hopefully I'll be around for later, is that these latest, greatest technologies are in their own way no smarter or wiser than what legend tells us was the first technology, fire, which would burn with the same enthusiasm under a pot of soup as it did through the library at Alexandria. The good news is that Lisa and Frank and Andrew and Hilary, between them, connect enough of the dots of what are wise and true possibilities in the use of these technologies to help the rest of us not only make sense if we're new to these things or terrified on the abstract level of them, or thinking about what to do next or with whom to work next to see that these things are good and constructive. This is the panel I've been looking forward to, and between them, they can connect those dots for us in a way that will help us all shape those fires. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, for those of you that were here yesterday, we spoke a little bit about the mesh and liberating data, that data is the key to begin to build these intersections. And today, I have three really wonderful colleagues here who go deep in the various areas necessary to make all the meshiness play out. One of the key pieces as we start to think about data is the new place that we're moving to, or really where we are today, is that we can capture data in many, many places where we couldn't before. So whether it's with mobile devices or other really small in cost and size sensors, we have the ability to basically sensor all sorts of things, whether it's buildings, people, activity, et cetera. The business of liberating data speaks to the heart also of ownership in terms of, well, who owns the data? And so we'll have a discussion about that. And lastly, the last piece is the analysis. So the data is captured in one place and analyzed by many people from different perspectives, reaching all sorts of conclusions. And there's real currency in the data, but also obviously in the analysis. When we think about city planning and the design and the pulsing of a city, to make the planning and the designing be consistent with the pulse, that's one of the things that I think we will also get into. And so without too much more, I want to introduce Andrew Hoppin, who his name got mentioned before. He was the CTO of the state of New York, and he's going to give us
New York State Senate.
New York State Senate, I'm sorry. Did I just give you a promotion?
Yes.
And now has a company called New Amsterdam Ideas. He's going to speak to us a bit about what it is to be on the inside of the government.
Sure. So, yeah, from the standpoint of people working inside of government and using technology to democratize the political geographies in which we live, whether we think of that as our city or our county or our state or our country, a lot of this has been, if not initiated, significantly accelerated, we think, out of Obama's Open Government Directive, which he issued in his first month in office in January 2009, which called for the federal government to be more transparent, participatory, and collaborative. And concurrently, at the same time, I was appointed as the CIO, as Lisa said, of the New York State Senate, and we did our own version of that, calling on our institution, which was a little bit of a backwater in terms of government technology, frankly, to be more transparent, efficient, and participatory. And so, and then more recently, I've worked with New York City's Do It IT organization to some of the same ends. But regardless of what level of government we're talking about making it open, right? Ergo, the Open Government Directive, but not just open in the sense of transparent, so that we know what's going on and can root out corruption, although in the case of the state Senate, certainly that's relevant. But transparent also because it's, in order to be able to participate more effectively in our government, we need to be able to know what is going on. It's sort of a prerequisite to doing so. So transparency and participation are really two halves of a whole. And what's the point of participating more in our government from the standpoint of whether you're a constituent, a citizen, a resident, or working inside government, it's got to be about making government work better. So that could be in the context of having a tighter feedback loop with people who are being governed and giving them more of a voice and really democratizing government and using technology as our toolbox to do that. It could also be more efficient in the sense of saving money. Certainly the last few years have been a very difficult time for most governments financially, and being able to provide the same level of efficacy of services but at lower cost is certainly top of mind for government technologists as well. So to my mind, we've made a lot of progress over the last few years, and it has started with policy, such as the Open Government Directive, and here in New York City with Local Law 11, which was passed earlier this year, and is really the most comprehensive, arguably, open data law of any municipality in the United States. And I think it's really exciting, really bodes well for New York City in terms of the accessibility of the foundational asset for transparency and participation of city data. Similarly, the New York City Digital Roadmap, which the Chief Digital Officer of New York City issued in her first couple of months in her role, has been a really great roadmap for the other technology-driven democratizing initiatives that we are endeavoring to undertake here in New York City. So policy is one major foundational piece here. Data, as Lisa spoke about yesterday, and I'm sure we'll get into more in this panel, is another foundational asset. And the third piece, I think, is people and communities. And a couple of examples of that in New York City that I think are really profound are something called the Transparency Working Group, which we put together, relatively informal, but brought together as the Local Law 11 was being drafted as a bill prior to actually being voted on by the City Council and signed by Mayor Bloomberg. We brought together civic advocacy organizations such as Citizens Union, such as the New York Civil Liberties Union, to have a voice and a role in that bill drafting process. But we brought them together with technologists from Do It, from New York City, and we brought them together with technologists from the civic hacker community, if you will, the New York Tech Meetup. And it was really one of the first times that these three groups, some of whom are very technophilic, some of which arguably might even have been called technophobic at one time, came together to say, okay, what do we all want out of this, and how can we draft policy that is actually going to serve all of our needs optimally for the long term. The final thing I'll mention is in the realm of people and community is that New York City for 2013 is going to be a Code for America city, and Code for America is a national nonprofit that puts some of the youngest, brightest, innovative thinkers from the programming, from the technology world inside of city governments to innovate, and then networks them across cities. So cities are starting to collaborate around technologies that democratize cities through organizations like Code for America. And I'm really excited that New York City is going to be a Code for America city in 2013. I think we'll start to see some of these foundational elements turn into actual measurable results in a way that is less anecdotal and more systematized as we go into 2013. So thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Hilary, one of the big things that we were discussing is this business of capture, and many people are capturing all sorts of data with their mobile devices or many other ways. But certainly as we move around the planet, and with Bitly, perhaps you should let people know a little bit about what Bitly does. But it's pretty obvious that you would be an interesting person to talk about the business of shifting big data from the control of perhaps a big company like IBM or Siemens to a much more democratized collection, and then what Bitly's role in it is in all of that. So if you could enlighten us, please.
Sure, thank you. It's been pointed out to me that I represent the evil private corporate interests on the panel, and so I will do my best to try and represent that perspective. Given that I'm at a small startup that is a privately held company that is built around a data set. So Bitly, for those of you who don't know it, is a mechanism for social sharing that's built in across social networks. So if you look on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, et cetera, and you see the short links, some of which are branded, like the New York Times short links, some of which are branded Bitly, that's us. And so we see the content being shared across these networks. We see the behavior of people reading the content, which is actually much more interesting. And we see the content itself. And so we can start to build real-time models of attention to people, places, objects, companies, products within our infrastructure. And this is a fairly recent thing. Bitly is about 4 years old. We see somewhere around 300 million people engaging with content per day. So it is massive. It is at the scale of social interaction on the internet. And the data has really two fundamentally interesting dimensions, and that is time, of course, engagement through time and how ideas spread through networks in time, and space, that is geography. And so as a private company, mainly interested in delivering analytics to corporate clients and brands, we've managed to amass this intense data set, which is basically the biggest database of human gossip ever collected, right? And we can see it in geographic ways. And in fact, if anyone's on a device, if you want to go to twitter.com/BKLYNfood, we have a little robot that every hour tweets the top story about food being disproportionately viewed in Brooklyn, right? And you know people in Brooklyn love food, so it's always very good content. And this is, I think it's interesting in the context of the democratization of cities, because this is a new capacity. So all of the data we have could not have been collected in one place 5 years ago, even. That was just when we started to begin to be able to do this. And to do it at a cost that's affordable for a startup. So what's changed is not so much the ability to collect and analyze data at all, but the friction in doing so. And I can also speak as a member of NYC Resistor, which is a hacker collective in Brooklyn. There are lots of civically minded hackers or individuals who are empowered to get out in the world and gather data and then make that data available. So what's changed is not that the data exists at all, but rather who's empowered to collect it and who's empowered to work with it. And that's a fundamentally new thing. And New York, again, has been a great platform for experimenting with this. I also wanted to mention a nonprofit called DataKind, which actually started here. It's run by a guy named Jake Porway, who realized that there was data being gathered in government and nonprofits, and there were people with the power to analyze and make sense of it, but they were not connected together. And so he started a group that does exactly that. So it helps understand the problems over here and the capacities over there and build structures that solve both of them.
Terrific, thank you so much. Frank, one of the things that we think also is really important in this part of the conversation is to think about another movement that is happening in addition to the democratization of data, is also the business of making things. And so many of you may have heard of something called the maker movement. There's a new book out by Chris Anderson called Makers, or otherwise known as the DIY movement. But this is the business of people basically relearning through generations, or taking back the understanding of how to build things, how to make things. It could be food or other stuff, specifically hardware. So cars and carts and tables and all sorts of, it could be super simple or very complex. And so we're seeing a rise of, in the sharing economy, we're seeing a rise of places like Tech Shop, which is the most sophisticated workshop that you could ever imagine stumbling into, that basically has equipment that would be really expensive to buy were you to try to have one on your own. But it uses a gym membership model, so you pay $100 a month or something and have access to all these incredible tools and mentors. We think that that also plays a role in, as we think about cities and as we think about engaging people to plan cities. And so we have Frank from OpenPlans here, also based in New York, to talk to us a little bit about his view of data and democratization.
Thanks. So I'm going to very briefly present to you a couple of interesting components in the new democratic planning toolkit. So the toolkit comes in an orange bag. The first piece of the toolkit is an extremely sophisticated organism. It's one that you're very familiar with, intimately familiar with. It's entirely digital, has 10 inputs and outputs. It has an extraordinary sensory system and a very sophisticated communication platform built in. If you'd like to know more about this, you can come and talk to me later, and we'll explore that bedrock of the new planning system. Then we have actual technical tools. This may bring back memories. Some of you may still own one. This is what we now call a feature phone. It can send text messages. They're very powerful things, very short, 140 characters, but there's a lot you can do. You can find out where your bus is, you can give input into a planning process, you can say what you think about the state of your neighborhood. These are still in use by about 40% of the population. So there's something about when we think about democratic efforts around planning that we shouldn't forget about these. I don't need to talk about these. These are obviously the most sophisticated sensing devices any of us have ever owned. Very exciting. There's lots we can do on them. They're analytical platforms. You can have very meaningful, deep engagement with the planning process. If you're invited to participate through something like this, you can say where you'd like to see bike share. You can analyze the transit system. There's a lot you can do. There's a lot that we will see coming with these things. This is a slightly lower tech piece of technology. Thank you. This is a DIY traffic counter. You lay this out, and vehicles, bicycles, people travel across it, and just like the pro ones that the DOT and other people use, as the tube gets squeezed, it sends a little pulse down here, and it gets logged, and then you can take the data from this and analyze it. This is made in New York by a group called the Tomorrow Lab, based on 32nd Street. This costs about $80 to make right now. This is a very powerful thing. If you imagine this in the hands of community organizations, you can go out, you can shape your understanding of your neighborhood. You can go and collect data. You think speeding is a problem on your block, you can go and put these down on the block and measure it. And there's a community aspect to gathering that data and making sense of it and analyzing it. And then these things have the tools that you need to make sense of what you can collect with this. So that's a very sort of brief insight into just a few of the tools that we're now collecting and bringing into the planning process. And over the next few years, we're going to see them having a very big impact on the way that we shape cities.
Is this open source?
This is open source, yes.
Yes.
Awesome.
And we can play with it later if anyone's interested.
And we can hack it later when you're...
Right.
So as we look at the hacking of cities, and after listening to all of you, I think it's clear that the central point of control isn't in one place. And I'm curious to know, and perhaps hopefully you're also curious to know, are we putting city government out of business?
No, but we're changing the role of city government in that the city becomes a platform on which the citizens build what they want to see.
So what's the role of the city in that?
So from my evil private corporate understanding,
Please.
it has been the role of the city to make decisions about what infrastructure needs to be built and where, and to control the flow of information and data. And there is, of course, a democratic participation process where you go to a planning meeting, which you can see on your local public access stations, and they seem incredibly boring, but maybe you get your voice heard, and this sort of all rolls up, and then a plan comes down, and there's a contract, and somehow there's months of construction and whatnot, and things happen. But what's changing is that if people have the ability to make the changes they want to see and to understand the aggregate view without sitting at the top, then the city is acting as a platform on which people can make their desires heard. And they can even, in many cases, take action.
And do you guys agree with that, or?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a lot of excitement actually by people inside government that are trying to figure out how to do more with less, or how to do more, frankly, with just the same level of resources about innovating. And part of that is outsourcing the work of government wherever possible to other entities and, in many cases, individuals who can responsibly do it, and shifting government towards being more of an information curator and a convener, and sometimes an adjudicator of things rather than a direct labor or service provider. And that doesn't necessarily imply smaller government, but I think it does imply more streamlined government, more focused government really focusing in on doing the things that it uniquely needs to do. And at the federal level, another aspect of this is that we even have laws at the federal level that say that if there's a private sector, and to channel my inner corporate evil as well, there are laws that say basically if you if the private sector can do something better, government should allow the private sector to do it. And I also used to work at NASA, and that's a big thing there where a lot of people say, if NASA has been operating a program for a long time, there ought to be a private sector entrepreneurial alternative to that. So I think that's part of it too, from the standpoint of industry. But that aside, I think citizen sourcing government, empowering a citizen bureaucracy, moving towards a more direct democracy, all those things are really positive trends, and they're really exciting to those of us in government that really need to find innovative ways out of this box of needing to do more with less.
And is it excluding people who aren't, geeky, techie, data jockey types? Frank, what was your
I was going to reach my
facial expression?
my non-smartphone. No, I mean, sure, it can do. So like all planning processes, you've got to design the way you want to engage people to be inclusive. And I don't think technology is making planning less inclusive. I don't think planning was necessarily as inclusive as it could have been to start with. And I mean, to build on Hilary's point, we're able to do things now at the community level which just weren't possible before. We're able to take data that a city is making available and make sense of it, to make a plan that's guided by real analysis at the very local level. Like, you can get together with your neighbors and use free tools online to produce something which is then credible, and whether it's a traffic count or something else. So you're able to build a vision at the local scale which is as rich and robust as anything that traditionally only planners and people within a city have been able to do.
Yeah, and we see a lot of innovation actually happening in parts of the world that have a lot less access to sophisticated technology, even lower budgets than we do, now making its way back here to help us here.
Yeah.
So, Ushahidi, for example, came out of the election violence in Kenya several years ago, is now being used by New York City's Office of Emergency Management for their severe weather crowd map. Right? Open source software innovated over there, being used and creating value here. Yeah. So I think certainly there are issues of technology haves and have-nots, but there are a lot of really low or even no-cost technologies that are really empowering to people that in traditional offline, no technology processes would have had no empowerment either.
Yeah. And I think, at least from what I've seen, for example, with iHub and Ushahidi, and who are in Nairobi, Kenya, based there, which is an open source that's used for crisis mapping typically, but they're even opening up their tools to be used by cities or organizations for all sorts of things. So I think one of the main themes here is that as a global community, we have so much, but most of us don't even know what we have. So if we could share liberally and start to actually, between the cities, but also some of these platforms, I think we can go quite fast. What's your view of using these tools to prototype? Like, for example, you in your very sophisticated traffic counter. How do we use these things so that we do define, refine, and scale? That we basically prototype, test a lot, and then decide how sort of hardware gets laid down, big investments get made. Do you see that?
So I think that's playing out. That's playing out in two directions. So first of all, there's an amazing sort of uprising of small-scale technology and planning projects. So there's, whether it's DataKind, whether it's the projects that we're involved with at OpenPlans, there's a lot of open source, there's a lot of energy, people trying to find new ways to solve problems, creative ways that just weren't sort of on anyone's radar a few years ago. And then at the same time, the same technology that we're all taking advantage of is playing out at the sort of city scale. So if you take something as simple as traffic monitoring, you don't have to go and install loops under the road anymore. You could be buying a data feed, or you could be using an open data feed that's being derived from somewhere very surprising, like mobile music players. So if you're driving around listening to Spotify in your car, which millions of people are doing, you're basically helping to create a picture of traffic conditions in cities. So this is a sort of interesting turbulence where ideas bubble up, and what we're talking about that may seem incredibly niche is suddenly possible and available to a city to do something that they maybe couldn't have done before.
Right, and the cost of doing that is distributed because we're all using those sensors anyway.
It can be, or it could be that a large technology corporation wants to gobble up all of the data and then charge cities to use it. So I don't think it's a given that everything is going to be open and will be better because we're sort of on that trajectory. I think we have to work to take things in that direction.
Yeah. And what's your view, especially Andrew, because you had so much as an insider buying from presumably big corporations, and there's an issue of security and trust and all sorts of things. How do you, from the inside, view this democratization with respect to privacy and security and trust?
So there certainly are issues therein, but I think the bigger battle has been to open ourselves up inside government to see how the civic communities and tech entrepreneurial communities are doing things and to learn from that. So we've paid a lot of attention to the how innovation happens, how good ideas are propagated in the private sector and in the non-governmental sector. And historically, I think traditionally, particularly at the local level, we haven't been particularly good at that. We sort of live in our own silos more than we ought to. So that's why it's really important to have organizations like the Transparency Working Group that I mentioned, Code for America, this convening here today, and organizations like MOS be bringing these people with different experiences from different communities together, because I think that's how we learn what we would benefit from paying attention to more, particularly with regard to privacy and security. There's a lot of policy issues therein, right? And the policies in some cases really need to catch up to what's possible today. But I think also the industry needs to catch up. Traditional government IT vendors, by and large, the large established ones, are pretty happy with the status quo. And I think that we need to look for opportunities to disrupt that. And I'm a little bit biased, but I think open source is a really powerful tool in that disruption, which is really healthy and frankly not bad for business either. There are great open source businesses being built to very large scales today as well. And then the final thing I'll say is for the civil servants who are doing technology and information management work within government, I think that their role is going to be more and more and more important, and their skills are going to be more and more important. And occasionally there have been some fears expressed to me by people, and for example, public employees unions about, is this going to put me out of a job? And I think the reality is quite the opposite, but we do have to be sensitive to that as we engender these changes and implement policies that are going to open up.
So open source, just as a comment, is going back to this discussion of ownership, is looking at taking something and essentially making, being less concerned about who owns the intellectual property and making it a shared license. Do you guys believe that that is an inhibitor or an accelerator of innovation?
It's absolutely an accelerator of innovation. And I can tell you, as someone who is at a company that is built on open source, we could not have built what we built in such a short time without it. And we have in turn released some of our internal systems as open source, not just because we want to make the world a better place, though we have some ideas in that direction, but because if it's out in the world, other people are using it and improving it, and then we benefit from their labor at no financial cost to us. And so that in turn increases the rate at which we can build new things. And that has been a huge contributor to the startup community's development.
Which, just a comment, I think that this reality is fundamental to realizing where we are from a currency perspective, which is things that are shared have more value. And even though they had a bad stock day yesterday, even Google, if we looked at our searches from a year ago, the results that you get this year are going to be way better than the results you got last year, simply because all of us have been sharing the results, making Google a better engine. And I think increasingly we're looking at how do we make our cities benefit from the same thing. They're share platforms. We should all continuous reinvention and innovation.
Can I guess to follow up on the open source piece, I think the intellectual property is one part of it, but the way that you approach open source is different. So you build openly, you encourage people to take the software, redeploy it, tell you what features you're missing, you do everything in the open, there's a sort of total transparency. It's really interesting to think about why we don't plan cities that way, and what we could learn from the open source community when we embark on planning cities.
Super great point. I think I'll leave us there unless do you have any burning last fabulous sentences you'd like to leave us with? So I think can you repeat the last bit just about planning cities? Because I think that's really fundamental to a lot of what's happened in the last 2 days.
The bit about planning cities. Yes, I can. I think, now I want to embellish it, and I'll resist the temptation to embellish it. There's things that we can learn from the way that open source technology is built for the way that we plan cities.
Perfect. Thank you very much.